Palingenesis by Simon Harewood. Book 3, Heart of the Sear. Chapter 17, The Battle of Belruth. Sear entered the city of the Viron with scorn. This then was the coveted prize, the final goal of all the many cycles of training, of subterfuge, raid, and intrigue. Surely this easy victory was a testimony to the prowess of the Great One, yet it was not the kind that he relished, having been gained by guile rather than force of arms. Now followed the simple extermination of the people, like rats in a sewer, the systematic scouring of each structure, till every last inhabitant had been dragged out and killed. This type of action was tedious, if not irksome. He found no honor or satisfaction in slaughtering the defenseless. Fortunately, the greater part of the vermin were still outside the structures, fighting one another to gain a place of shelter. It would not take the whole night to finish the task. Then they would move on to the east, where there was at least a promise of a battle. He could hardly wait. Euban dragged the stool over to the wall behind his desk. The heavy wall hanging behind it would do perfectly for what he had in mind. The golden dragon on its scarlet background was large enough to conceal the doorway leading to the stores. In his haste, he almost toppled from the stool when the tapestry came off its mounting with a jerk. Den steadied him just in time, and was rewarded with the large hanging draped over him in a dusty deluge. It would have been amusing at any other time, but there was not a moment to spare. Already the fiend could be on his way into the keep. Why Euban was so sure the Swamp Lord would make for the temple, he could not say. Perhaps it had something to do with the statue, or the fact that most Nurians regarded the place as a sacred shrine. The very thought of that demon having his way in this place that had been Euban's realm for so long was unbearable. They dragged the heavy fabric through the passageway down to the door, not caring whether it was spoiled or damaged in the process. It would have been a punishable offense during the days of the questers. Now such thoughts were absurd. Den rushed back up to fetch 2 stools. He returned to find the old man struggling with the cloth, swearing roundly over the clumsiness of his maimed hand. They quickly placed the stools on both sides of the doorway and prepared to raise the tapestry up to cover it. The metal hooks over the arch were old and frail, but they held the cloth long enough for Euban to drive the 3 nails he had brought with him into the wall. They got down to survey their handiwork. The heavy curtains seemed to hang there only by a miracle. Euban pointed to the stools.
"Carry these back up and fetch me 3 more nails from my table."
The boy obeyed, scampering off up the dark passage. He had hardly left when Euban heard the heavy footfalls of armored men approaching. There was no time to think. The key was still in the lock where he had left it, on the outside of the door. In a moment he pulled it shut and turned the key. He whirled about to face the intruders, praying that they had not noticed the curtain falling into place. Round the bend they came, Malik's guard of giants, on their way to the temple. A fury rose up in him, such as he had not felt for many a cycle. Euban drew his blade with his good hand, composing it as it left the sheath. The fiendish warrior saw him in the half-dark as he did so, and prepared to rush him. He did not give them the opportunity. Screaming out his almost forgotten battle cry, Euban charged the Tour guardsmen. They watched him come, preparing to strike down this nuisance with a single blow, their massive swords at the ready. The blade found a mark, again and again, before they could retaliate, and their steel cleaved the air to spark loudly off the stone walls. So ferocious was the onslaught that the oversized figures retreated back up the passage, their fellows behind blundering into them. Malik watched them fall back and expected to find the fanatical remnant of the guard, down here left behind to defend the temple in desperation. When he caught sight of the single figure of a feeble old man, he stared in astonishment at first, then in incredulity. His look was enough to spur on the proud men of his guard. Even so, two of the giants were left bleeding from arms and legs before the fierce greybeard had breathed his last. There was a little more caution now as they proceeded down the passage. Inside the door, so hastily covered, Den sagged down with his face in his hands. The old man had had no opportunity to find safety in this improvised shelter. There would be no one to share the fearful hours to come, to reassure him that they might escape the horrible fate overtaking all of Nuria. Now he was utterly alone in a city of enemies, all seeking his life. That same hour, the great host of Ranald and his allies set out once more for the beleaguered city. They had covered 20 miles since the morning, and were almost as many short of the capital. The men were worn but confident, being on target for the planned confrontation. Rune and Lund stayed with Ranald, Hunnick, and the captains now. There was little conversation, even Raelf showing signs of strain. Of all the men there, Rune knew the lay of the land best, and Ranald broached the subject of a camping site within range of Belruth.
We need a place concealed from direct line of sight. Of course there will be no fires tonight. Still, I don't want the glint of moonlight on a sphere to give us away.
They may have scouts watching the road for our approach,
Rune replied.
It may not be possible to come up on them stealthily.
Ranald shook his head.
Our scouts have not reported any encounters thus far. They have to be as far as the Dark Weed by now. That monster must be convinced we pose little threat to him at this stage.
There is a place that will serve,
said Rune.
east of the river, about a mile. The road twists through a number of low hills, among which we could hide till before daybreak. It is 4 miles or so short of the city. We can strike out early and arrive with the sunrise.
Ranald nodded, satisfied.
I will send out a detachment to secure it and make sure there are no prying eyes about.
The main body proceeded at a slower pace now, and Rune estimated that they would not reach the hills before midnight. The hundreds of stragglers coming behind would be even later than that. There would be little time for sleep before they were required to fight what could be the greatest battle of that age. They glanced at Lund striding next to him. This one was ready, there was no doubt, and would have the strength to meet the challenge. During the afternoon, the host from Gilreth crossed the Stillwater where the bridge was still intact. Byran suspected that the road there could be watched by Malik's scouts, but his vanguard found no sign of the enemy in the vicinity. Could the Marsh Lord be so confident that he cared not for their approach? It seemed improbable. He would assume that the Southerners had been warned and proceed beyond this point with the utmost caution. A well-placed ambush by the Tour could do great damage to his host, if not wipe them out entirely. Much depended on whether he could deploy his men in their proper formations to face the enemy, and even more on the strategy he had conceived to give them a chance against the overwhelmingly superior forces. Scouts went out ahead of the host to watch key points. Into the evening they marched, watching the sun slowly descend into the clouds on the western horizon. They would need the cover of dark to set up their prepared positions on Hein's Rise, as well as drag the heavier war engines into place on the plains below. Garrelane would be in charge of readying the ambush, while Malvor volunteered to set up the bulky machines within sight of the walls. His men would need to work in absolute silence, for if they were noticed by any of the enemy guards, not only would their lives be forfeit, but the carefully laid plan would come apart also. The carts were unloaded behind a little rise, and the machines rolled forward on their small, sturdy wheels. Each had a dozen or more, well greased so as not to make a noise. It was a painstaking affair, the tired men straining against the weight over uneven terrain, careful not to stumble in the dark. Once on top of the rise, Malvor gazed ahead into the open ground before the city. He caught his breath at the sight that greeted his eyes. A sea of tents lay before the walls, the campfires flickering like thousands of stars in the distance. He could smell the strangeness of this invading scourge on the cool night air, and imagined the sounds of drums and revelry. If there were pickets about, they would certainly be distracted by the noise of their own encampment. The walls and towers of the castle were dark and silent. A feeling of dread and futility descended on him, and he shuddered involuntarily. Others had followed him, and were standing aghast on the little fringe of land. He turned away abruptly and motioned to them to tend to the machines. Setting them up in silence was an impossibility, and with the enemy so near he would not risk the least amount of noise. The contraptions would be loosely joined together to appear functional. Whoever would man them could secure the extensions later if they so desired. Since there was hardly enough ammunition for a few rounds, it mattered little. They left the assembled engines on the reverse slope of the rise, obscured by vegetation. It would be better to leave them out of sight when the sun rose, so as not to draw suspicion and allow the enemy to interfere with their deployment. If needs be, these could be advanced slowly the next morning. Quietly, relieved, the men slipped back to their hidden camp for a much-needed rest. Byrand waited in the main camp for a touch from the Sear. Veer was the only link between him and the host from Arran. It was imperative that the Westerners did not attack too soon the next day. They had to allow the men from Belruth to draw out the enemy first, making them vulnerable to an attack in the rear. When finally it came, he felt the apprehension of this ancient for the first time, a disconcerting sensation. He conveyed the details of their plan, stressing the importance of a coordination between the attacks. Veer acknowledged this briefly. He warned not to underestimate the tour host based on previous experience of war, commended Byrand for his efforts almost as if he was saying farewell, and was gone. In the darkness of his cold tent, Byrand felt suddenly forsaken. Lund glanced up at the stars above before he ducked into the makeshift tent of the Aranite king. It still amazed him how different they looked, now that he was free of the pleading desperation of slavery. In Grail they had been distant spectators, unsympathetic to the plight of the oppressed. Here they were beacons of understanding, for he knew now that there was a heaven that answered the prayers of the weak and weary. The men were gathered round the low illumination emanating from coals in a brazier. Even this was screened off from the tent door with a wall of stacked shields. He took up his position among these venerable men of the host. Every face wore the marks of fatigue and concern. Every eye was set with grave determination. Rune addressed the gathering in low tones.
I have heard from the Sear. Gilreth is in position in the east. Byrand aims to attack in the morning to draw the enemy towards him. We are to attack as soon as they are engaged in that direction. This will give us an early advantage, if Malik does not anticipate such a tactic.
What if he does?
Asked Raelf.
Then we have to use our own surprises to breach their formations. He will not know about Lund and our Viron contingent. I suggest we deploy them to the south to attempt a flank attack if Malik leaves a formation facing us. That way we can press the superior numbers of the enemy from 3 sides against the walls of Belruth in the north. They will have no room to make use of this superiority, with all their flanks hemmed in. This will also present our archers with an easier target.
He will certainly use the fire breathers to break out of it,
ventured Lund. The circle of heads nodded at this.
If we press them hard, the beasts will not be able to use fire on us from fear of harming their own ranks. They will have to attack from behind. This will expose them to our archers.
Will arrows from our bows be able to pierce their bodies?
Wondered Ephraim.
We will not aim for the armored bodies,
replied Rune.
If we can pierce their wings and weaken them sufficiently to ground the monsters, they could be overcome by spearmen attacking from all sides. Of course, this will be a difficult task, while facing the hordes in Malik's host simultaneously. I suggest we hold back the Inrathians for this task. The blades they possess may be invaluable in this struggle.
Ranald agreed quickly. more than a little relieved that he would be spared facing off with these mythical beasts.
I support this strategy. We should take care, though, not to shoot wildly at these creatures. The missiles may fall on our own forces. The men in charge of these formations will have to be instructed carefully.
We have an expert in Bior,
Affirmed Rune.
I would entrust him with this task.
There were quick nods all round. Ranald turned to his captains.
Captain Ralph, you will lead the left flank, closer to the wall. Earl Wayne, the right flank is yours. Evrain will lead the center, and I will command the reserve. It is a straightforward attack to be pursued with speed and energy, never allowing the enemy an opportunity to regroup once engaged. Make sure your formations stay in line with the center, and keep close contact throughout. If there is an attack from the south, link up with the Viron as soon as possible.
He looked at Lund, who nodded in understanding. If the enemy were to be hedged in, there ought not to be gaps through which they could escape and cause mischief in the rear.
King Ranald,
Rune had a final request to make of the Aronite sovereign.
with your permission, I would like to assign the Nurian garrison troops to the reserve. They are of doubtful quality and should be used only in extreme circumstances. We cannot even deploy them in a fallback position, for if the main body is driven back, they will certainly run. The best use to make of them would be as long-range archers.
Certainly.
Ranald did not point out that only a little while before these men would have perished rather than stand with Aronites. Such thoughts had already become obsolete.
At the earliest opportunity,
Rune continued.
I will attempt to enter the city. If anyone can convince Lucane to support our forces, I will. In case of absolute disaster, there will be a refuge to fall back to. Watch for a red and white pennant on the westernmost tower to be sure of my success.
Little remained but to wish one another well for the day of battle. The men clasped hands, drawing strength and encouragement from the resolution of their fellows. Rune lingered a moment or two while gripping Evrain's hand.
Imran preserve you,
he whispered. Clouds were massing in from the west. Already the stars were obscured. The heavy air stirred uneasily. Lund walked with Rune and Hunnick to find their makeshift beds in the murky night. Only a few hours separated them from the tempest that would engulf them on the morrow. The powers unknown and unmeasured to the east seemed like a single living organism, spreading its nightmarish tentacles over the land and through the sky to ensnare and bring to ruin all the north. Yet he felt light-hearted, confident even, with such companions as he would never have been able to imagine striding next to him. These were his comrades in arms, the great men of destiny, and he was included as one of them, a runaway slave, the cowering prey of hunters, the dog unworthy of speech or a name. Now kings and lords sought his counsel, and he could plan the downfall of his oppressor with princes. He breathed in the free air, a smile forming unbidden on his face. The city was silent this night, silent and dark. Nothing stirred in the narrow streets, the cobbled courtyards, the stone walkways. Smoke oozed lazily from a few high windows to be driven away by the rising wind. The people of Belruth, of old Nuria, lay scattered about in their dead city, betrayed by the kings they had trusted, the priests they had believed, the traditions they had created. Not since the summoning was such a scene to be witnessed in the north, and now, as then, the devastation had swept away all the great towns of the west, and the achievements of many generations were finally undone. Yet there was no witness to mourn the tragic end, no sympathetic lament to celebrate the passing of a people, unless the trembling form of a young guardsman, weeping in the silent dark of the stores, ignorant as yet of the massing of hosts beyond the gates, could take on the voice and verse of the bard at a burning. Rune shivered in his blanket. He opened his eyes to find someone kneeling beside him. It was one of Lund's boys.
Lord Rune, it is time.
He recognized the whispering voice as Brennig's. Lauren's eyes were not visible towards the west. Quickly he glanced at the sky to the north. Through the gathering wispy clouds he could make out the blade and its tip. Perhaps half an hour remained before the morning watch commenced. He nodded and yawned, stretching out his shoulders. Despite the nervous anticipation, he had dozed off and slept soundly.
Can I bring you something?
He smiled at the respectful tone.
Water, and whatever we have to eat.
He was not hungry in the least, but he knew the demands made on his body today would be far better met with sufficient sustenance. There might not be another opportunity for eating till that night. The boy scampered away to comply. Rune dressed with care in the semi-dark. A rosy hue blossomed on the eastern horizon, bathing the camp in an eerie light. He saw the stirring figures of Lund and Perthale, readying themselves as he was, donning a clean shirt and hose, the black surcoat with its amber eye, buckling on boots and girdle. Then came the crafted leather bracers for wrists and knees, and the amulet to complete the septalion. He reached down as they did to pick up the blade, the assurance of its potency washing over him. There was power enough here, he realized. The real challenge would be when to use it to best effect. Brennick returned with a water skin, a cup, and a large bowl containing coarse bread and fruit. He lingered till Rune had selected what he wanted before passing it round to the others. The deep red eastern sky was brightening. They sat in a half-circle watching it, dipping their bread in water to make it easier to ingest quickly. Each one felt the urgency of that harbinger of day descend upon him. Rune looked down at his hands where he held the sweet fruit that would round off the hasty meal. A strange sensation stole over him, as if these were not his hands alone, but those of kings and princes lost in time, fathers and sons who strove for truth and illumination, in worlds without count and ages beyond reckoning. For a moment he was awed to take his position among them, to step out on the path that would uphold the motives of such a great host, regardless what sacrifice was required. Gareth passed a restless night, filled with dreams and struggles, sometimes in the dark underground of Lakeside, sometimes perched over the dark fields before Belruth. He woke several times, gasping for breath, his fingers exploring the place where the collar had been, to reassure him that it really was no more. At the urging of the Sear, they had remained in the towers for this night still. The converging forces coming to the aid of the stricken city would not be ready to make their move before dawn. It was pointless arriving there before they did, yet he knew already that the hosts were too late to save the fortress. He had seen the king fall, and the vile beasts stoop upon the fleeing men, abandoning their battlements and towers. When Sith finally came to him, he was sitting up in bed waiting. The Vaedran helped him, as that first time they had met, to dress in all the unfamiliar accoutrements that accompanied the blade. There was the bow also, its string wrapped round the stave and neatly tied at the grip. The quiver contained but 5 arrows, 3 of which were tipped with chrysolite. At last he was ready, smiling nervously in thanks to the little man. They set off for the lower caverns, hurrying through the dimly lit hallways. Gareth felt the apprehension knotting his stomach. His mouth was dry, his hands clammy and awkward. He tried his utmost not to think of the day ahead, the perils and the threat of unbearable loss before him. Veer waited for them by the gate. He still wore the guise of Kennath, but the blade rode on his left hip, and the jewels of the septalion glimmered in their mountings. His face, as usual, betrayed nothing of what he felt. He nodded to Sith and extended a hand in farewell. The Vaedran gripped it, his brow furrowed in an effort to command the welling of emotion.
You know what needs to be done.
The final instructions were spoken in a near whisper.
If we fail, you will hide them all in the hand. I will come back, regardless of how long it might take. I am grateful to you, Sith, for your selfless, faithful service these many cycles. In all my time in this place, I have not had a friend more dedicated than you. Farewell.
The Vaedran backed away, unable to reply. Soon he disappeared through the doorway, swallowed by the darkness beyond. Gareth watched him go, the grief of this parting too much for him to acknowledge and remain composed. The seer brought him back to the present.
We leave the towers at last, to face the demons of this hour. Did you sleep at least?
Gareth nodded quickly. He turned his eyes towards the portal and back at the man in a questioning glance.
To Belruth?
His voice was not quite as steady as he had hoped. Veer placed a hand on his shoulder.
Yes, the time has come.
A sad smile touched the corners of his mouth.
Are you ready?
There was no resistance in the Vale, not that he had expected any. The place was quiet, deserted, dead. The peace he had felt here before had utterly departed, leaving only memories of vivid, puzzling moments steeped in peril. The pain of the world outside held at bay by a comforting presence he half hoped to see standing beside the stone marker at the crossroads. But there was no sign of the old man. Though Gareth knew wherever he was, Cale was aware of them passing through. The pathway leading to the Belruth gate was strangely overgrown, though he knew the grass and shrubs in this place did not change with seasons and the passing of time. It had purposely been altered in this way, obscuring the road to memories at once shameful and intolerable. They picked their way through in silence, till the solid, heavy, brass-bound door loomed up ahead. Here the seer halted momentarily. Gareth fought in vain against the rising panic closing up his throat. The death tree on that cursed hillside seemed to lean over him. A shadowy figure, hooded and impossibly strong, reached for him, inside him, to tear away all that he was. An arm encircled his shoulders. A warm voice breathed in his ear.
Be brave now, for the sake of those you care about.
The trembling receded. He found his voice again.
The city is dead.
Yes,
Veer's voice was resigned.
Lucain was deceived to the last. That advantage is lost to us. I sense no enemy presence in it, though. Malak abhors the place too much to make use of it.
He reached out a hand to turn the ornate metal ring. Gareth heard the shrill call of a night owl. They stepped out into the cool morning air. Already the eastern sky was pale red with the approach of Imran's orb. Veer picked his way among the ruins of the old city, the boy following like a shadow in his wake. Nothing stirred on the walls of the fortress ahead of them. There was no sign of life anywhere. The air was permeated with the stink of burning, not only the wood of structures and furnishings, but that sickening reek of singed flesh. They halted in the deep shadow of the northern wall. Gareth noticed suddenly that Kenneth had departed and the winged man had taken his place. Just when this had happened he was not sure. There was no gateway allowing entrance to the city in the north. He wondered if they would try to steal round to the south and seek entrance there. It would be risky, since the enemy camp would certainly be on that side of the fortress. Veer had other ideas. He leaned down to whisper in the boy's ear.
There are no sentries on the walls. I will take you inside, to one of the lookout towers above the King's Gate.
Gareth regarded him strangely, remembering the giddy moments in the past, when a strange figure had pulled him through time and space to the inside of the mountain. Nothing that sinister was about to unfold, however. Veer nodded reassuringly, motioning him closer. He took the bow from the boy, leaned down and placed his free arm under one armpit.
Hold on tightly.
Gareth put his arms round the man's neck a little apprehensively. He heard the whisper of the tall wings unfolding. then felt the contracting of the straining muscles like cords under his fingers as they came down in 2 quick beats, lifting the 2 bodies from the ground without effort. He looked up at the tilting wall, the streaking stars peering from behind an encroaching blanket, and remembered the giddy flight of the Broadwing. He wriggled to look down, causing Veer to tighten his grip on his passenger. The sensation of flying was so exhilarating that he was almost sorry when they cleared the wall and soared for a few breathtaking moments over the structures and roofs of Belruth. The stale smell of charred wood and cloth intensified. Before he could see properly, they landed on the south wall, just below the tall watchtower to the west of the gate. Veer did not wait for comments or questions from the obviously excited child. He thrust the bow back at Gareth and pressed a finger to his lips. The king's gate was open wide, and beyond it lay a forest of enemies, their sentries patrolling the perimeter of the vast encampment. Quickly, noiselessly, he ascended the stone steps of the tower, dragging the boy behind him. The post was deserted, Gareth noticed with relief. He would not have to share it with some poor dead soldier, trapped and murdered here by surprise. He caught his breath as they peered down carefully over the edge. Malik's massive host lay below them, bathed in the eerie light of dawn. Strangely, now that he saw it in reality, and not through the nebulae of dreams, it did not appear quite as irresistible and intimidating as before. It was made up of real creatures, of flesh and blood, and not the unassailable phantoms of nightmare. He felt the solid stave of the bow in his hand, and hope surged through his heart. The seer let his gaze sweep over the camp, all the while keeping watch for any activity, visible or not, that would betray the enemy's awareness of him. He knew the touch of the Greycloaks, even that of their master, very well. Without his queen, he was not nearly as perceptive as among the bogs of his southern lair. It would not be too difficult to remain beyond his reach. There was something wrong with the camp below them. Though he could see the sentries pacing up and down, and the glow of many fires burnt away to mere embers, he had expected more activity, especially now that the sun was rising. In a moment his eyes lost their focus in speculation, while he explored the tall tents and stacked supplies. It was as he had suspected. The host from Terrallen was expecting an attack. Inside their shelters the men were awake and battle-ready, already eating their morning meal. At the first sign of the enemy, they would rush forth to confront them. There would be no surprise attack. He leaned down to tell the boy and instruct him to relate the discovery to Rune and the Aronites. His thoughts turned to Byrand, warning the Count to take his time and not attack prematurely. Then he searched the countryside for concentrations of the enemy that could indicate traps or ambushes set for the advancing hosts. It appeared that Malik was little concerned about the western threat. He had to be aware of the newly acquired art in Gilreth. This was the only challenge his day would bring. Byrand watched his son strap on the leather armor worn by the champions. Garolain smiled at him as he turned his back to his servant to secure the fastenings behind.
We are ready to march. Where are Rune and Aaron?
I have heard from the Sear, responded the Count. We are expected.
Good. Let's not keep them waiting.
Gary lifted his blade from his stand and buckled it round his waist. Byrand regarded him with a little concern. Such confidence, though inspiring, could lead to recklessness. Stick to the plan, Garolain. Remember, I will wait with a line of defense. Make sure you gain it with the host still intact. The confident smile widened.
I know. We have gone over this many times. You just keep those flyers off our backs. We will lead them right to you.
They stepped out into the morning together. The first rays of the rising sun broke over the eastern horizon. A narrow strip of clear sky remained there, the rest already overcast by heavy clouds from the west. There was a hint of the faraway ocean on the air. Already the columns were lined up for the short march to their positions. Byrand looked at the formation that would accompany him to the prepared position on Hind's Rise. 800 of his 1,200 archers, mostly the younger boys, as well as the Slayer squads and a few extra blades, would head northwards instead of westwards to the battlefield. Garrowlane would wait till they were well concealed before opening the assault. The war engines were already in their place on the rise, the traps were set. He gripped the hand of his son warmly. Imran preserve you.
And you.
They turned away to lead their respective formations, each one secretly fearing in his heart that he would not see the other alive again. Though the touch from Gareth was fleeting and almost cryptic, to guard against detection and discovery, Rune gathered more from it than the information regarding Malik's readiness. He understood at once that Gareth was nearby, perhaps close enough to observe the enemy host. It was a welcome realization, and he felt somehow encouraged and strengthened by it. There was no need to hurry forward and risk being noticed immediately. The men were marching steadily to cover the miles still separating them from the city, but they took care to move as quietly as possible. The greater part of the stragglers had closed up with the main body during the night. True to form, they still brought up the rear, though not miles, but merely yards behind the rest. As soon as they left the hilly terrain, while there was still cover in the form of woodland, Lund and his formation veered off to the south. He would circle round and place his men on the road leading up from Tew. From there he would advance to put pressure on the enemy host and keep them from deploying their massive numbers in an outflanking maneuver against the Aronites. Hunnic and the Inrathians marched well behind the others. Each of his men had a bow and several bundles of arrows. Theirs would be the dangerous and difficult task of bringing down the fire-breathers. Bior thought that this could be achieved with a well-coordinated effort, but Hunnic had his doubts. He would be happy to immobilize the beasts and attempt to destroy them from a distance. Closing in with spears could prove to be beyond the capabilities of his fighters. A mile away from the city they reached the fringe of trees where the woodland gave way to meadow. Ranald called a halt. From here Raelf and Wayne would take their men to north and south, deploying the wings of the great host. This would only be done once the attack from Gilreth was already underway and occupied the full attention of the enemy. The sun lifted itself above the horizon, immediately dipping into a cloak of dark clouds. It would be a dismal day. Lund hurried his group along. The terrain was almost familiar to him, woodland with trails crisscrossing the greenery. Only the undergrowth was not nearly as dense as in the dank wood. Soon they crossed large clearings, meadow-like and partially hedged, obviously farmland. When they reached the southern road, he would spread out the 1,000 spears and place his 200 bows behind. 40 of the boys with blades would be deployed among the front ranks, but he would keep the 15 best with him to join his scouts. These would serve as the spearhead of his attack. Slowly, almost deliberately, the formations from Gilreth took up their position on the low rise where Melvor had set out the war machines the night before. These monsters were now moved forward into plain view, even if they were to remain well behind the main battle line. Sham detachments were left behind to pretend manning and steadying them for action. The host advanced in a V-shape, 7 formations of almost 500 spears, each led by 3 champions. Tucked in directly behind the lead formation came the 80 men from the Blade Company, with 400 archers behind, almost in line with the rearmost formations out on the flanks. Garrowlane strode forward with confidence, blade in hand. With such a fine force at his command, they might not need a retreat after all. Every man now could clearly make out the enemy camp. There was no sign of any activity as yet. The city of Belruth to the north was silent and lifeless. That advantage had been lost. With such a massive force confronting him, perhaps Lucain had simply capitulated. He halted the host less than a mile away from the first line of tents. The Southlanders would soon tire of their games and crawl out to face him. Surely the Aaronites had to be in position by now. Eduukir gave the long-awaited command, and the drums started immediately. The cautious enemy would not be lured into a confusing struggle among the structures of the camp. It would be a set battle after all. All about him men emerged from the skins and canvas of their tents. The Viran waited for them on the plains to the west. The day of final reckoning was at hand. In the midst of the multitude, Malik Yulian stepped onto a makeshift guard tower perhaps 30 feet above the ground. About the base stood the Loktiai and priests, surrounded by the tall Tur champions. Slowly, he raised a hand to his eyes to ward off the glare towards the east. He scanned the horizon, smiling to himself. Yonder lay the last Viran host from Gilreth, with its paltry little toys behind it. How much easier and more gratifying it would be to crush them here, rather than break through the walls of their city in the east. He sensed the meddling of Vir in this convenient outcome. He should remember to thank him at the judgment. Where was Kale the Mighty? Was this all he could conjure after 600 cycles of preparation? It was ludicrous. He would test their quality and resolve with a frontal assault by the Amul elite. Let them exhaust their art against the Southland hordes first. Then they would taste what real power was. He nodded to the Amul chieftain, the most loyal of his commanders, and the battle was begun. Gareth watched the almost lazy deployment of the Gilreth host in the east. He had not realized that there were that many soldiers in his uncle's realm. They marched in formations unlike any he had ever seen in Nuria, expressing confidence and potency with every step. They had the art, he remembered, though not quite in full measure, for they carried the blades only. What would protect them from the dragon's fire? Behind them was a row of war engines, though they were leaving these behind. The stir below him caught his attention. Immediately his fear multiplied. The sea of tents dissolved into masses of armored bodies forming up in columns for the march. Suddenly, the splendid eastern host appeared insignificant in size. Quickly he looked towards the west. In the trees he could discern the outlines of figures, the men from Arran. They would have to move quickly to prevent the eastern force from being overrun. Rune was in those trees somewhere, with Hunnick and Bior. He glanced back at the host below the wall, trying to locate the shifters. A platform had been set up for a lookout post. He wondered why they had not made use of the city towers, then looked about him nervously to make sure that they had not. Malik had to hate the place intensely not to allow any of his men inside it. Large figures, armored and menacing, surrounded the platform, but these were not the worst of the Swamp Lord's creatures. Inside the formation of 100 or so, another group stood about, hooded in dark cloaks. Others mingled among them, dressed in robes of gray. He looked away immediately. These were the dangerous ones, like the old man who had told his captors to put that collar on him. Gareth noticed his hand had strayed up to his throat again. He lowered it in irritation. The sky had turned brassy in the east. There was no wind. The tour host had arranged itself for battle. A small detachment, perhaps the size of the Gilreth host, headed off towards the south. The dark warriors that looked like Amul formed ranks facing the east, a great horned figure at their head. The drums were deafening, throbbing, their frantic rhythms pulsing through the stones beneath his feet, the ground, the air. A massive formation of marshlanders turned about under orders to face westwards. Malik was aware then of the arrival of Arran. Gareth saw huge, hulking figures among them, led by handlers on chains. The marshland host set off at the same time as the Amul, washing forward like the waves of the sea. Gareth's heart sank at the sight of them. So many, too many. Yet there were more formations that remained round the platform. A mixed group of desert fighters and brigands, perhaps 4,000 in number, lingered near the city wall, and another, more than double the size of this one, kept watch to the south. Gareth turned to find the Sear behind him.
Who are those?
He whispered, pointing to this last group.
Why do they not join the others?
Those are the tour. I had no idea there were so many of them left in Myril. All those around the platform.
He indicated the overlarge armored figures, the cloaked and hooded crowd in their center.
Are also Tour. Of course you know what they are. 13 of them. His perversity knows no bounds.
Gareth could hear the whispered concern in the other's voice. So many fire breathers would be hard to overcome. The sinister priests he could not fathom, but their presence so close to the master signified their status and worth in his schemes. It was clear, though, that the Amul horde was not going to wait to be attacked in their encampment. The huge formation spread out to north and south at increasing speed, shaping itself into a crescent with bulging horns, many times the size of the approaching Viron force. Gareth gripped the wooden guardrails in front of him in anticipation. The fierce and epic struggle was about to commence. In his thoughts was a pleading prayer to whoever lent inspiration and guidance in the confusion of this world, wordless and intense, for an outcome other than what his reason dictated. Behind him, the Seer stretched forth a hand to place it on his shoulder. Even in the many caverns and halls of the towers, a strange atmosphere of apprehension and anxiety had descended. At the table she shared with Asar and the others, Haldred could think of little else but the terrific struggle unfolding in the Northland this same day. She remembered the shining ranks of Aaron, the Viron youths, the dark Ingrothians marching away. Were they even now engaged with the enemy, fighting for their lives? Could the outcome already be decided? Surely not. The uncertainty was a torture in itself. How long would it be before they would know one way or another? She caught Asar's eye. He forced a smile, the usual cheerfulness entirely absent from his countenance. Sitting next to him, Maris' face was pale and drawn. No doubt he still suffered great pain. Even as she scrutinized him for signs of it, he looked up, though not directly at her, and his expression altered greatly. She glanced behind her to find two figures approaching their table. Both were Viron, a girl of Cura's age with long blonde hair, and a younger boy, dark-haired and serious-looking. The pair came up to the table, then moved around it to an empty seat beside Maris. The girl pulled back the chair before addressing herself to the staring group.
Imran's blessing on you this day. We are helping Sith to care for the wounded. He's occupied elsewhere. I am Serdwin, and this is Lurin.
She placed her hands on the boy's shoulders as she introduced him. For a fleeting moment, Haldred looked into the dark feline eyes of the child. He smiled at her, and the troubled thoughts she was entertaining seemed less severe. Seredwin sat down on the chair while the boy, Lurin, to Haldred's surprise, attended to Maris. He opened a satchel containing several flasks and gourds, selected 3, and placed them on the table. Then he set to work mixing the powdered contents in a bowl. Asar spoke up, breaking in on her fascinated observation.
I am Hassar of Brek. Maris and Cura you know already, I think.
He straightened up and took on a proud bearing.
This is Princess Haldred of Ligerian, and her son Arid.
The Viron girl appeared a little surprised. She rose to her feet quickly.
Forgive me, Princess.
She looked at the dressing on Haldred's forearm.
You are one of our patients also. Please, let me see to your wound.
Haldred found herself acutely embarrassed. The form of address, the pride others took in it, was more of an irritation than anything else. Moreover, the arm no longer troubled her. Being free from infection, it was merely an inconvenience.
Please, simply call me Haldred. And my arm is fine, really.
The girl paid no attention to her protestations. There was no choice but to let her loosen the dressing and examine the arm. She talked in low tones as her deft fingers worked.
I know a little about you. You are from the lands between Nuria and the marshes, which have been devastated. You and your family have suffered much.
There was real empathy and understanding in the eyes of Seredwin, a welcome awareness.
We are alive still, when so many have perished. And certainly, if we had, there would be no one but ourselves to blame.
Haldred found herself opening up to the stranger, with whom somehow it was easier to share the fear and uncertainty that had been her constant companions since Freyne's Point. She could pour out the essence of her long struggle, the despair and moments of utter panic, without reserve. The tale she had told several times over was no longer just an account of events unfolding, but an old worn garment to be taken off and stored away. As she made her weary way once more over recent seasons of dark fear and near despair, Haldred could fully appreciate the many perils she had weathered. Long after the others had left the table, they still sat together, Ceridwen relating the dark chapters of her short life also, till there descended on them a comforting silence, a strong realization that these sorrows were far away, belonging to a somber yesterday now left behind.
Do you think there is a chance of prevailing over the shadow?
Haldred was pleading for reassurance from this girl, younger in age but not experience. The Viron reached out and took hold of her hand.
I would never have thought so till recently, but I have seen so many miracles, so many impossibilities come true. The Tuor Lord can be overcome, and his terrible plans thwarted.
The pressure on her fingers, the sincere blue eyes, the passion in the young voice, convinced Haldred that this was true. Miracles. Had she not seen them also? Could it ever have been imagined that she would find shelter in this foreign place after that first encounter with Hekan's men south of Nikoma? How many times had she been snatched from the very jaws of death? Who had warned that boy to witness their despairing moments upon the sea before they had even arrived there? How had he brought the awareness of their plight to his father several days' journey away from here? Yes, there were many occasions worthy of consideration, and much hope to be gleaned from them.
How will we know whether they have prevailed or not?
I wait here for that message,
Replied Ceridwen.
whether it comes from Gareth or Lund or Lord Veer.
But if they should fall?
If they should fall, I will know it. Then we will follow the Vadran southwards into the Hand. There we may hide for a long time before we can be discovered. Sith told me of its formidable defenses. Now that we have escaped the lair of the Tuor, it will not be so easy to eradicate us.
Haldred felt relief that there was someone within reach who would give her the longed-for tidings as soon as there would be a result.
Do you know where they are now?
Ceridwen gave her a strange, slightly concerned look.
They are about to join battle before the walls of Belruth.
Across the plain advanced a multitude of dark shields. Above them a thicket of spears, borne ever onwards by the tide of pulsing drums, masks of violent death, over-honed purpose, pressed into ranks irresistible. Forward, forward over the fields, 10,000 on each flank surged ahead to deny the enemy a place of retreat. The war songs broke out, shaking the ground where they trod, and they beat on the shields with steel and fist, a tempest of fearful temper, assured in its own sufficiency. Ahead, the staggered line of the northern lords waited, ranks of ragged teeth on which the mighty waves would descend. And in their eyes blazed the same resolve, the same absolute defiance born of desperation that had prevailed over those who had sought their destruction before. Their hands gripped the tall spears, the chrysolite blades, the Vadran bows. Above the silent Viron the clouds grew thick and dark, lowering as if to touch the field itself. On his platform, the Shadow Lord saw the harbingers of the art and gnashed his teeth. The cloaked figures of his priests looked up in eager anticipation, ready to impress with their accumulated skill, their machinations long prepared. The finger pointed, and a sigh of satisfaction escaped their throats. Half the number set off in the wake of the advancing horde. Garelane of Gilreth watched the armored ranks come within range of his bows. It was a terrifying force, 10 times the size of his, of warriors fierce and tall, picked from among the cohorts of the Southland tribes for their exceptional skill and quality. He nodded to the sergeant at his elbow. A drawn-out command rose above the increasing din. 400 bows were raised. 400 shafts sped off to wreak their havoc among the approaching enemy. Volley followed volley, as quick as they could draw the bows, and the fields were stained with fallen warriors, crumpled forms left behind in the trampled grass, some bent double over a protruding shaft, others dragging a limb. Yet the trudging ranks hardly appeared thinned by these losses, and the horde quickened their pace, the ranging flanks spreading round the Viron island, well ahead of the rest. Closer they drew, shouting and bold, eyes vacant but for the singular purpose of spilling blood. A mere 10 paces separated the lines when the blades were awakened. In the fields above the massacred city they caught the fire in the air, the ground, the clouds, breaking forth in arrays of brilliant color, and the sky trembled under their song. The plain heaved under the stirring power. Funneled clouds reached down to answer such a fierce call. The front rank of the surging wave was breached in many places, several men deep, the shock of it halting the advance temporarily. The great shout rose up from the Viron spears as they stepped forward to strike at the stunned enemy, and more warriors went down as weeks before the salve. Trumpets sounded, and the ranks closed up as before. Gareth watched the display with absolute incredulity. He could not tear his gaze away from the dazzling interplay of streaking color, so vivid under the ever-darkening sky. This, then, was the art of the battlefield, a power feared and detested by the Shadow. Surely such supremacy could not be overcome, even with the twisted power the Dark One had accumulated. The Sear touched his shoulder, directing his stare of wonderment to the field behind the Amul hold. Grey-cloaked figures were advancing there in a tight squad of determined menace. Even as he watched, they halted, well short of the host. 3 of them stood to one side, as if engaged in a private conversation. The remaining 10 formed up in close formation, the leading figure raising a hand in the direction of the Viron line.
What are they doing?
In his excitement, he almost forgot to whisper. When there was no immediate response, he looked up at the concerned face of the man behind him. Veer's voice mirrored his expression.
I don't know. Some manipulation they were taught in the pits of Non-Merrick, no doubt. This will be a twisting of the art to aid their warriors.
While he spoke, a flash of reddish light emanated from the group, seemingly directed by the extended hand of the priest in front. Even from a distance, they could sense the burst of power, bowing the brush and stirring the air into urgent uproar. A streak of red leaped away wildly, like forked lightning, arching into the waiting wall of Viron shields. Garolain felt a sick pressure, as of a sudden fever spreading through his body in a wave of giddy pain. He glanced down at his limbs, though he was sure that nothing physical had touched him. Awareness intensified, of a force invisible, resisting the art but recently awakened inside him. It was suddenly difficult to think clearly, even to move normally, as if his limbs had gained twice their usual weight. He knew it was a deliberate attempt to disrupt his thoughts, to render him incapable of command. Somewhere an enemy battle priest had singled him out. He resisted, as he had been instructed, casting aside all thought but the contact with his blade, yielding to the wonder of its chrysolite composition till he saw nothing else, and heard only the faint hum of potential emanating from its expanded edge. The confusing instant followed, during which he caught an imprint of the other, not 1 but 3 combined, their boiling hatred, their eager malice, their fading confidence, and finally their sudden fear. But he would not hurt them. Not yet. It was too early to spend his strength on such as them. The blow from the 10 others caught the Viron completely unprepared, punching a hole through their line, scattering the bewildered men like leaves before the driving wind. Several lay still, never to move again. Others were helped to their feet by their stunned comrades, just moments before the surging Amul closed in on them. Another blow followed quickly, with a lift of the first, this time centered on the 3 champions in the front of the formation. The Amul were so close that many of their own warriors stumbled or fell under the impact. Yet the lead blade master, caught by the full force of it, reeled backwards, dropping his blade from senseless fingers. Before his comrades could recover and come to his aid, he was skewered by several enemy spears. Sergeants shouted frantically, shoving men forward to fill in the gaps thus opened in the line. Garolain gnashed his teeth, unable to discern whence this new threat had materialized. He had no great vantage point where he stood, and could barely see beyond the lines of his own men. One of the Viron battle priests rushed up to him from behind.
Just beyond the enemy formation, 200 yards back.
He turned to a sergeant, shouting,
Drive them off! Take 100 archers and fill that place with arrows!
The man turned away to do his bidding. The red, crackling shaft reached out for the Viron line again and again, striking down indiscriminately. Gareth saw at least as many Amul go down as did Viron, but the latter had far fewer replacements to fill the gaps.
Should we not tell him?
He could see the same concern he felt mirrored in the eyes of the seer, but Vir just shook his head.
We will betray ourselves with so many priests about. Your uncle is not blind to the enemy manipulators.
As if in answer to his claim, a small cloud of arrows arose above the line of battle, descending on the cloaked figures causing so much mischief. The first volley fell short, but the grey figures ceased their activities immediately. Another cloud was already coming their way, and they beat a hasty and bewildered retreat. Even so, one of their number was struck down before they could hasten out of range. Twice more the arrows reached after them before ceasing. They seemed reluctant to venture forward after this, not sure whether the Viron were able to detect them or not. The Viron host was hard-pressed to keep the massive enemy numbers from enveloping both their flanks. Garelane signaled his trumpeters to sound. It was time to put the first part of his plan into action. 4 quick blasts were repeated over and over, rising above the terrific din, the drumming and screaming, the clash of spear on shield. The rearmost Viron units advanced, spreading out to north and south. The right flank closed up to the walls of the city, thus preventing the enemy from rounding them in that direction. In the south, an intentional gap developed between the outer 500 and the main body. Eager enemy warriors poured through it, charging at the archer formations behind. These last were concentrating their barrage on the enemy in the north, where the Amul left wing was now milling in large numbers against the walls of Belruth. Garelane nodded to the commander of the Blade Century. The dark uniform spread out in a V-shaped formation, the blades stirring to life. He watched them advance, clothed in confidence and power. Now the southern warriors would learn the meaning of fear. The scything surge brought an echo from the thundering clouds above. Enemies caught in the turmoil of the charge simply melted away like the dry sun-tide grass before a raging fire. Within moments, the gap in the Viron formation was sealed, cutting off more than 1,000 enemies from their own host. Instead of striking a blow against the vulnerable archers, they found themselves in the path of the devastation meted out by the blades of the Viron. Still they resisted, true to their reputation, their death songs already sung, and they fell, almost to a man, striving in futility to resist the tempest that had overtaken them. Across the field, still hidden in the fringe of thick brush to the west, uncertainty had overtaken the commanders of the Aramite host. They watched the careful deployment of the massive marshland force, and realized soon enough that it had been pre-arranged to thwart their supposed attack. Ranald turned to his captains, frowning.
They are aware of us. At least half their force is faced in this direction. There is nothing to gain by delaying our attack.
The captains nodded in agreement. Rune watched the huge press of bodies advancing in ragged ranks with amazement. These were the cohorts Malik had trained in secret in his southern forts, the rabble from the streets of Lakeside, the meanest vagabonds scrounged from the stinking pits of Terrallen, the back parts of Munborg, the eastern deserts. No doubt many were no more than thugs who would have no stomach for a pitched battle, but the fear of their lord would drive them forward, and the massive numbers would boost their morale. It was hard to estimate the fighting capabilities of this diverse assembly.
We must press them hard. There are those among them who will break if they are pressed,
he observed. Evrain pointed to a formation lumbering forward to a central position. It was made up of about 200 massive figures, each led by a handler on a light chain.
What in the name of Imran are those?
Hanik was the first to reply.
Half men from the Fangils. They can be very dangerous and do much damage, but they are not here willingly. If they are hurt, they will run, not caring in which direction. You should leave them to the Inrathians.
But the Inrathians are in the back, pointed out Raelf.
There are more of them, exclaimed Wayne, scattered among the regulars.
No,
Anik countered.
those big brutes among the warriors were bred in the marshes themselves. Malik's attempted a superior class of warrior. They are powerful, but notoriously stupid.
These lumbering shapes, slightly smaller than the Halfmen, seemed to bear out this claim, staring dully ahead from vacant eyes. Nevertheless, their muscled frames warned any onlooker of their potency as shock troops, even if they were not deployed as a unit like the other brutes, but rather shared out among the cohorts to bolster their abilities. Ranald estimated their numbers at well over 200, and his concern deepened at the realization.
Wayne,
He turned to the seasoned Earl.
at my signal, I will reinforce your wing with 2,000 men from the reserve. You will attempt to roll up their left flank and push them against the city. Our best chance is in allowing them no room to let those beasts reach our formations.
He looked suddenly serious and resolute.
To your places, my good men. We commence our attack.
Rune made his way back with Ranald and Hunnick, only slightly relieved that he would not have to charge in with the initial assault. The force of the Swamp Lord was largely unknown. He would appreciate an opportunity to gauge its quality from a distance. The Inrathians were set up in 3 formations, in order to support each of Ranald's wings and the center. In front of them stretched a long line of Aeronite archers, 4,000 strong. These would engage the marshland host as part of the main attack, switching to the defensive only once Malik's flying beasts were spotted. Rune took up position with the group closest to the city wall behind Raelf, leaving the center to Hunnick and the right flank to Beor. Tyro stood with him, nominally in command, but preferring to act on Rune's instruction. The men also seemed to welcome his presence among them, showing their appreciation with nods and smiles. Though he had never fought with them before, he remembered them well from the training on Heron Inrath. The trumpet sounded the advance. The main body stepped out of the trees and onto the field of battle. Evrain shouted to his sergeants to keep the men in check. Discipline and tight formations would give them the advantage over the hordes ahead. No gap should open between them and the flanks. With 30,000 men surging forward, sustaining such cohesion was no easy task. The enemy ranks hesitated as they came into view so abruptly, then exploded in jeers and battle cries, shaking their array of weaponry and beating on their shields. The first flight of arrows sped overhead, smashing into the packed body of warriors from above. The sight of enemies going down under this deadly barrage was encouraging. Soon an answering volley rose up from the marshland host, however, and the Aeronites hastily raised their shields in the march to protect them against it. Soldiers fell, pierced through shoulders, arms, and legs, gasping, crawling out of the way of their advancing comrades. The bows of the Rallan were shorter and less powerful, but there were 1,000 of them. Evrain gritted his teeth, remembering the arrow that should have killed him in the underground of the mounds. He did not relish the thought of an enemy missile piercing his body, yet he did not bring up his shield higher than customary. It would be unbearable obscuring one's view when the hand-to-hand engagement was about to commence. He kept his eyes on those towering beasts, touching the hilt of his sword. The stray thought that the captain should also carry a long spear was quickly dismissed. Surely there were enough men to keep these brutes away from him. Again the arrows sailed overhead. Again the enemy warriors stumbled and fell under them. Now there were but 20 yards separating the lines. The marshland force bulged out in the middle as the warriors started their charge. He heard their screaming battle cries, saw the gaping mouths, the bulging, insane eyes. Then the lines met head-on, a drawn-out crunch of steel on steel and hide, and the cries evolved into moans of pain for the stricken, yells of triumph for the victors. The hand of the sergeant touched Garolane's shoulder. He whipped round to look at the man.
Sir, from the lookout, Aaron has started their assault.
He stared at the fellow in surprise, then straightened up to stare into the distance. It was hard to make out anything so far away. Could the lookout be mistaken?
You are sure of this?
He shouted. The man nodded vigorously.
Completely.
Just then he caught the darkening of the sky as a flight of arrows rose on the far side of the city. There could be no mistake. Uncertainty overtook him. Why had they not kept to the plan? Perhaps they had been discovered and forced into the open. He would have to rethink the strategy, and quickly. With the Aaron attack already underway, it would be an unnecessary risk retreating and exposing his force to pursuit when he did not have to. Should he send back a runner to urge Byran forward? Surely they could use the extra archers and blades to annihilate the Amul already under pressure. Without the aid of the priests, his blades and unrelenting line of spears were proving too much for the Southlanders, despite their vast superiority in numbers. Already the right flank of the enemy crescent was wavering. If he could break them, the rest would be pushed back into the burnt-out village. The marshland force attacked without cohesion or coordination in the center, and despite their greater numbers, made little impact on the Aaronite wall of shields. In the south, however, Earl Wayne's wing was quickly under pressure, facing some of the enemy's crack troops, and the terrific impact of a concerted charge by 20 or more of the oversized groups. The Aaronite archers were concentrating their barrage on the forces opposing Raelf's wing near the wall, since it was here that the enemy had to be pressed hard, thus denying them room to maneuver. This plan would go awry, however, if the right flank of Aaron were to be driven back. Evrain watched with horror as the half-men sentries were brought into the fray. They waded into his soldiers oblivious of wounds or pain, sometimes smashing through the front rank with several spears dangling from their huge frames. It seemed that nothing short of decapitation could bring them down. One by one they were overcome, but not without causing havoc among the Aaronite formations, and allowing the marshland thugs to penetrate behind them. The neat, orderly assault was turning into a nightmarish chaos, conditions that negated the strength of the western force entirely. One brute managed to charge through all three ranks, plowing into his little reserve behind. In haste, Ephraim drew his sword, his ears filled with the bellowing of the wounded beast. A few steps and the horror would be upon him. Marshland arrows still rained sporadically on the host, and a dozen or more dropped down on the area where he stood waiting just then. The towering form crumpled, almost in the act of swinging its massive mace at the captain, an arrow protruding from the back of its lifeless skull. Ephraim barely managed to avoid the bulk as it crashed to the ground. He looked about him in bewilderment. There were gaps everywhere in his line. The entire center formation was about to dissolve into chaos. The trumpet call brought him back to his senses. Ranald had ordered 500 men forward to bolster his sector. With sword in hand, he led the charge to drive back the enemy and stabilize his line. At first the fighting was intense, the warriors from Taralan refusing to yield their hard-won position. But soon enough they were thrown back, bruised but far from broken. In the north, Raelf had the best of it, facing fewer of the monstrous hulks that were so effectively used as battering rams elsewhere. The murderous rain of arrows from Aaron's bowmen took their toll also, demoralizing the enemy and breaking up their resistance. Soon the marshland host was giving ground steadily, and the Aaronite force gained momentum with their three-stepped advance. As the flank turned, Evrain noticed the pressure on the center lessen. The plan was working. Raelf kept up the advance. Ranald released the 2,000 men as arranged. He kept a wary eye on the north, though, where Raelf's men were pressing forward. The archery barrage would now switch to the south to support Wayne's attack. It seemed the marshland host would be beaten unless their master intervened quickly. Ranald scanned the skies over the enemy for signs of that dreaded interference. He had not long to wait. There were men ahead of them. A line of 500 or more straddled the road and adjacent fields up to the tree line on either side. Lund watched them with apprehension. The formation was perhaps 10 deep, several times the size of his makeshift force. He wavered for a moment, not sure whether to proceed against them or simply to occupy them here while the real soldiers did the fighting further north. Keeping so many enemies out of the battle would certainly help the others to gain the upper hand. Pushing his Viron boys into a confrontation where they were outnumbered 5 to 1 would result in many deaths, if not complete failure. Still, he had been entrusted with the task of attacking from the south. Who could have foreseen that the enemy would leave such a strong force to guard the road? Almost reluctantly, he gave the order to form up in the assault formation. It was a relief to notice that the enemy had few archers in their formation. The 200 bows at his command would come in useful. Berthael was by his side, scanning the enemy ranks ahead.
I have never seen these before. They are not from the south. Neither are they Tuer.
That is true.
Admitted Lund.
They are badly equipped and do not seem eager to attack us, even though there are so many of them. Perhaps these are weaker than the rest.
Join found himself in the middle of the Sea Raven host, his feet firmly planted on the Nurian highway from Tube. He could see the approaching enemy formation clearly, and was puzzled at first by the diversity in size of the soldiers. With a shock he stumbled upon a possible explanation.
Vadran,
He mumbled under his breath. Then he regarded the taller figures closely, noticing blades on several of them.
with Nurian blade masters among them.
He added, loud enough for the men next to him to hear. Quickly the rumor spread through the waiting host. The enemy force, though much smaller in size than theirs, was made up of elite warriors from Fenvale, ready to decimate them with sorcery. Lord Zebar appeared particularly uncomfortable, having had no intention of participating in active combat in the first place. Now he would be attacked by possibly the most potent and sinister of the enemy forces, and this would certainly reveal the ineptitude of his supposed warriors. Nevertheless, he had committed himself to this battle, and would have to make an effort to save face if he desired a say in the dividing of the spoils afterwards. Men were whispering uneasily all about him. The whispers turned to murmurs as they saw the enemy draw their blades and compose them. A flight of arrows appeared overhead as the enemy archers loosed their first perfect volley. Zebar screeched at his archers to let fly at will before ducking behind his bodyguards to avoid the incoming missiles. Johin decided not to tarry any longer. Dropping the heavy shield, he backed out of the formation in haste, making for the closest cover as soon as he was free. Without looking back, he knew that many others were following his example. Lund watched in amazement as the enemy formation melted away before their eyes. Before the first arrow had fallen among them, almost half the men had taken to their heels. Spears and shields lay abandoned everywhere. How could they possibly be so cowardly? He remembered something Rune had told him about an arrangement with a former comrade. This had to be the Sea Raven contingent he had been talking about. Quickly he signaled the archers not to target the fleeing horde, but rather those who remained in the battle line. Zebar made a frantic effort to regroup his dissolving force. He screamed obscenities at the running men, swearing to take his revenge on them as soon as the battle was over. Even if this prevented some of his men from panicked flight, the slaves he had forced to bear arms paid him no heed whatsoever. His right flank disappeared almost entirely, obliging him to thin out the center to a mere 3 ranks. Lund gave the order to advance, taking the lead himself. Few arrows proceeded from the enemy to hinder their approach. It was gratifying to know that these vultures were afraid of him. The blade was in his hand, ready to deal death, but he decided to follow Rune's advice and use it sparingly. Such adversaries as faced them now would hardly be worthy of its full power. It was more difficult than he had imagined to hold back the force behind his blows once he engaged the shouting, milling ravens. Even though they were inferior warriors, their intentions and aggression were all too real, and the violent sweep of their swords, the wild thrusting of their spears, would still hurt and maim the Viron all the same. One large fellow with a 2-handed axe appeared braver than the rest. or perhaps his way of conquering fear was to launch himself headlong into battle. He singled out the leading Viron and came at them shouting and swinging the axe. Belruth moved to cut him off, blocking the massive swing with his blade. The force of the blow was such that his weapon was almost knocked from his hand, leaving him exposed for a moment, sufficiently for the pirate to slam the heavy blade into his chest. A sharp, grating sound rang out, bringing Lund round, staring in surprise. About the body of his friend, shimmering faintly before fading again, he could discern the outlines of the chrysolite armor, a crested helm, plates of the ringlets from chin to ankle. He watched in shock as Belruth reeled and dropped to his knees. The attacker gaped at him, astonished to see the body of his victim free from any visible wound. The blow had been of such force as to cleave the enemy almost in twain. Quickly he raised the axe to bring it down on the bowed head. He never had the chance. Lund's blade touched the throat of the large man, robbing him of motion instantly. The body sagged down to the ground with a sigh. Lund gripped Belruth's elbow and heaved into his feet.
No time for slacking.
He shouted, hiding his relief. Belruth, still winded from the blow, gave him a reproachful look, but could not reply for several moments. Instead, he gripped the blade and staggered forward into the thick of the fight. Though the Raven force outnumbered them still by 2 to 1, there was little resolve among the islanders, and they soon broke before the determined assault. Lund watched them scatter into the woods to east and west, but did not order a pursuit. These enemies were hardly a danger, and served more as an irritation than anything else. The Viron would forge ahead to join the main conflict, where their contribution would be sorely needed. From the watchtower above the King's Gate, the field of battle seemed much less chaotic. Malik's huge armies were being pressed from east and west, slowly, grudgingly giving way before the men from Gilbreth and Aramil. They still outnumbered their opponents, but the great press and lack of space negated this advantage completely. Arrows descended on the packed ranks regularly, taking their toll each time. Gareth found himself staring more and more at the silent, motionless figure of the Swamp Lord on top of his platform. What game was he playing? Could he not see what was happening? He turned questioning eyes on the Sear.
Why does he not send in the dragons?
Veer was watching Malik intently.
He is waiting.
For what?
For me, or Kale, to make an appearance. But he will have to do something soon, or his great hosts will be in real trouble.
As if in response to this observation, the dark-cloaked figures under the platform suddenly came to eager life. They spread out quickly, almost vying with one another for the best and first opportunity to effect their transformation. Gareth could feel the sickly sensation of it washing over him. His limbs grew heavy, and his pulse became erratic, till he could do little else but stare in horrid fascination at the gyrations of dust and air below, an alchemy of perverse power, looting substance and power from Myril for their profane purposes. Even the grey cloaks recoiled from them, huddling together under the platform of their master. From here they watched the armored shapes take to the air, gaining height in a slow circle, 13 monstrous birds of prey, bred for this hour alone. All the confidence he had felt, all the hope at the sight of the art among his countrymen, drained from Gareth's heart. Who could resist these foul creatures? They passed under the tower, close enough to make out the red gleam in their eyes, the dripping saliva, the dull play of light on each scaled bulk. He drew in his breath, gasping, sobbing, utterly convinced that the hour of destruction had arrived. Through the paralyzing despair, he noticed the body behind him grow tense. The hand of the Seer slipped from his shoulder. A great shout rose up from the fighting men across the field. Evrain did not know whether it came from his men or the enemy, yet it was sufficient to lift the gaze of seemingly every struggling warrior to the skies. There they were, a squadron of dreadful dark beasts, their wide bat-like wings driving them higher and higher. The monsters of imagination had taken form at last, and the sight of them was unbearable.
Imran, preserve us.
The sergeant at his side stared up at the swirling fiends with stricken, bulging eyes, the weapons in his hands forgotten.
There are so many!
Evrain tried to count the number, a dozen or more he was sure, and he did not know how to deal with a single one. Garrelane froze almost in mid-stride. His eyes had to be deceiving him. The huge vulturine shapes rising from the enemy camp could certainly not all be fire breathers. He looked about him in a panic. His men were fully engaged with the enemy. Even the 80 blades were committed to deal the Amul a resounding blow and drive them back to their camp. This was the worst of times for the dreaded beasts to appear. He had lingered too long, sensing the victory when he had hardly engaged the vanguard of the enemy host. It would be supremely difficult to pull back now, and the feared Tuur beasts were already taken to the air. What was he to do? They were defenseless unless they could lure the beasts to their slayer squads. Even so, there were so many more than 3 monsters to trap. He brought up a gloved hand to his mouth in forgotten prayer. The host was doomed. They had willingly and confidently marched into Malik's trap. On the Tew road, Lund felt the nightmares of the Dankwood overtaking him. The slow spiral of doom rose above the enemy host like a portent. Here was the worst of situations about to develop. This is what he had dreaded all those agonizing seasons in Grail. The fire breathers would have them exposed in an open field, unable to flee in time. Only a small portion of his force could hope for protection from the wonder of the Septaria. All the others would be vulnerable, despite the fine weapons and shields they bore. Even among the blades there were those not yet sure of the armor. He looked about him. Rin did not even possess a blade as yet. How would others like him survive the onslaught? Should they head for shelter and abandon the field? The trees could serve to confuse the creature's search, perhaps. The blade in his hand suddenly became impotent, a toy in comparison with the twisted might of the enemy. But then, he had never had anything better with which to face the Tuur masters. Would it not be best to take his stand here in the middle of the road, to resist him one final time? Was it not enough that he had endured this long, had come this far, to stand on the soil of the Northland he had never known before, and shout his defiance in the teeth of impossible odds? Slowly he lifted the blade, gazing about him deliberately at the stricken faces, the fearful eyes. Then he marched off in the direction of the whirling demons, not heeding who would follow or remain behind.